Prague Spring and the Invasion of Czechoslovakia by Nate Babbitt. The Cold War was more than just a time when tensions were thin between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was also a period in history when various European countries tried to gain their independence. One of these countries was Czechoslovakia, known today as the countries of the Czech Republic and Slovakia. From the end of World War II to 1967, Czechoslovakia was a communist-ran satellite nation of the Soviet Union. It was a land where farmers and workers were poor and struggled to survive everyday life, and the Soviets, as well as their own government, abused and mistreated their own people. This silently went on until May of 1966, when the public started to make complaints about everything that was happening within their borders. In October of 1967, citizens of Czechoslovakia removed their political leader, Antonin Novotny, from office and replaced him with Alexander Dubček in the earlier months of the following year. Dubček, before he was elected, was the first secretary of the country's government. Once Dubček was placed into office, he began his program of reform, which was called the Prague Spring. In the Prague Spring, Dubček wanted to loosen the grips of the Soviet Union and the ideas of totalitarianism, yet keep communism as their main political party. Government officials were allowed to oppose and challenge any policy brought up, and were allowed to follow their gut when making decisions. There was also an end to censorship, which gave people the rights of free speech, media, and the ability to criticize the government if they wished. Farmers were given rights that made opportunities to take control of their work rather than the government doing so. Trade unions were also able to negotiate for the members of which they had. This reform movement that was taking place sparked a feeling of fear into the Soviet Union. The Soviets thought that if Czechoslovakia continued to create reform policies, other satellite countries would follow in their footsteps and try to break away from the Warsaw Pact. In 1968, the Warsaw Pact invaded Czechoslovakia and soon took control of their capital of Prague. Most of the soldiers that invaded were from the Soviet Union, and the rest consisted of Bulgarian, Hungarian, East German, and Polish forces. In the video coming up, eyewitness accounts of the invasion from both sides are described.
On August 21st, and now we can say it freely, we occupied Czechoslovakia.
Ibrahim Asayev from Kazakhstan was a tank driver during the invasion of Prague.
I could hear the planes in the air, and the world shook a lot because, of course, the tanks were in Prague.
Ivana Dolezhalova was 19 years old. In the preceding months, during the Prague Spring, the Czechoslovak government, led by Communist Party head Alexander Dubček, succeeded in passing democratic reforms, widely known as socialism with a human face. To the Soviet leadership in Moscow, this was unacceptable.
The ground forces entered first, and then the firing started. And then we understood that we'd landed in a meat grinder.
Alexander Mitko was with the 194th Airborne Regiment that flew into Czechoslovakia.
Before this, we had flown to countries of Warsaw Pact, and we were welcomed everywhere. But this time it was like, take that.
You are facing, at a very short distance, the soldiers who are invading your country. But what you see is faces of young, innocent boys. You see the confusion in their eyes. You see fear. You realize that it's not their fault that they were sent over.
They told us to our faces we were occupiers. We said, how can we be occupiers if we're just carrying out our orders? What do you mean occupiers?
Thousands of people gathered outside Czechoslovak radio to protect this source of uncensored news.
Od rána do této chvíle obklopujete rozhlasovou budovu v Praze na Vinohradech, abyste bezmeznou obětavostí i hrdinstvím prokázali svou důvěru a nabídli i svou pomoc nám v rozhlase.
It was clear that once they get hold of the media, the country might be pretty much lost. Of course, it did then turn into much more violent act. Then I disappeared. I didn't want to get killed.
Later in the morning, the Soviets ran into the building. They did find the studio. They were on the air, and they stopped the broadcasting.
Pavel Pechacek was a producer at Czech radio.
Then what happened, it was almost a miracle. Russians didn't find small studios of Czechoslovak radio all over Prague. People destroyed names of the streets on the walls of Prague. It was difficult for Soviets to really know where they exactly are. They were broadcasting for a number of days underground.
There was, though, this incredible solidarity amongst people who went to the streets and who started basically negotiating with the Russians. There was also a little bit of fun, of course. This nation has that in its veins. We had these banners or slogans like, you know, Ivan, go home, Natasha is waiting for you, and stuff like that.
Běž domů, Ivane, tady tě holky nemilujou, běž domů,
Some
Ivane.
people claim that Czechs and Slovaks were rather cowards, that they didn't fight. And I have to say, it's not true. In such cases, like 1968, Czechs were, I think, brave enough.
After 24 days, the Russian tanks withdrew, but Moscow was back in charge.
Retrospectively, I think it was inevitable, and I think it was naive to think that Brezhnev would let it happen.
We can say that Soviets had to come. We hoped they will not, but somewhere inside we had feelings they probably finally will, and they did.
That was deceit from our part. We felt it.
I was left with a bitterness in my soul. Why did I get into this? They basically hadn't done anything wrong.
Thank God, those days are over.
The Czechoslovakian army was greatly outnumbered compared to what the Warsaw Pact had assembled, and since they did not want any more bloodshed than what had already been done, they ordered all soldiers not to fight. Once the Soviets gained control of Czechoslovakia once again, they introduced a curfew to all citizens of the country and added a censorship that restricted freedoms of speech and media. Dubček was also arrested and sent to Moscow to receive the demands of the Soviets. Dubček agreed to the demands, and all that had been accomplished at Prague Spring had suddenly disappeared. Prague Spring and the invasion of Czechoslovakia showed just how far the Soviet Union would go in order to keep someone from disbanding from the Warsaw Pact. In order to justify what they had done, the Soviets created the Brezhnev Doctrine, which said that they could come into any communist country whose government was being threatened. They later used this policy to justify their invasion of Afghanistan in 1979.